So Clinton speaks in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism, and yet assiduously serves corporate power. So he passes NAFTA in 1994, which was the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act. He passes the omnibus bill, crime bill, which sees the explosion of the prison population. By the time Clinton leaves office, you have 2 million prisoners. We now have 2.3 million. 25% of the world's incarcerated. We are 5% of the world's population. Almost all of them are people of color. And the corporate state is feeding parasitically, whether it's through phone companies, private commissary companies, private prisons, guards, private guard companies, because if you're a poor person in post-industrial America on the streets, you're not worth much to the corporate state, but if they put you in a cage, you generate $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And that's the business of mass incarceration. And it's Clinton who began it. It's Clinton who deregulates the FCC. So you end up with the consolidation of roughly a half dozen corporations controlling what 90% of Americans either listen to or watch on the airwaves. And it shrinks the parameter of acceptable debate. Reminds me of what Dorothy Parker once said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. It goes from A to B. Well, it's sort of like, so it's, should we just bomb ISIS in Syria, or should we bomb them and put boots on the ground? Like, that's the debate. That's kind of where we're at. It's Clinton that destroys welfare. And under the old welfare system, 70% of the recipients were children. And it's Clinton that rips down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, destroying the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act, which precipitates not only the national financial crisis, but finally the global financial crisis. But Clinton understood that if he did corporate bidding, he would get corporate money, so that by the 90s, the Democratic Party has fundraising parity with the Republican Party. And when Obama actually runs in 2008, he gets more. And Obama has continued this trajectory. So there's complete continuity on all of the major structural issues from Clinton to Bush to Obama. Obama's assault on civil liberties, in fact, has been worse than Bush. The misinterpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as, in the eyes of the administration, giving them the right to assassinate American citizens, wholesale surveillance, and Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. And some of you may know I sued Obama in federal court. Now, this Section 1021, which overturns over 150 years of domestic law, permits the U.S. military to, in essence, carry out extraordinary rendition on American soil against U.S. citizens, strip them of due process, and hold them indefinitely in military facilities, including in our offshore penal colonies. The language of that section says that they can seize any citizen who substantially supports, now that's not a legal term, that's not material support, substantially supports the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or something called associated forces, which again is a nebulous term, and to hold them in military facilities until, quote unquote, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is forever. So we sued Obama, and much to the surprise of just about everybody, including myself, the case was called Hedges versus Obama, we won. And this created a real quandary for the government, because using the military for domestic policing is patently unconstitutional. in the same way that wholesale surveillance of every American citizen is patently unconstitutional. And so the courts have essentially used judicial fiat to strip us of our constitutional rights. And the reaction of the Obama administration was fascinating. So Judge Catherine Forrest, who issued the ruling, issued a temporary injunction, meaning the law was invalid, was taken out of effect. And that was on a Friday. And her 112-page opinion, which is worth reading, I mean, she talks about how this, in essence, opens the door for criminalizing an entire class of people, and she brings up the internment of 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. So once that ruling and injunction is passed, the government sends not just the federal attorneys, but attorneys from the NSA, from the Pentagon, from National Security to her chambers and demand that she put the law back into effect. And to her credit, she refuses. And so at 9 a.m. the next Monday morning, they appear at the appellate court, the Second Circuit, which is the next higher court right below the Supreme Court, and demand in the name of national security that the Second Circuit put the law back into effect until the appeal is heard. So the question that Carl Mayer and Bruce Affron, the two lawyers who brought the case and did all the work on it, and I was joined, by the way, after we initiated the case by other co-plaintiffs, including Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg and others. The question was, why did they react so aggressively? And I think the only assumption that we could come up with, or I think was clear, was that they're already using the law. That there are most probably U.S. Pakistani, U.S. Afghani nationals being held in black sites. And if they could ever get out, and if they could get legal representation, and that injunction was in force, then the government would be in contempt of court. So what happened in the Second Circuit is kind of emblematic of what's been happening throughout the judicial system, whether it's with Citizens United or the FISA warrantless wiretaps and everything else, was the court, which has become a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state, had to find a legal mechanism to justify the stripping of our constitutional rights. And it was really only a question now of how they were going to do it. So I had also been a plaintiff before the Supreme Court in a case called Clapper versus Amnesty International. This was a case brought by myself and other journalists against wholesale surveillance before the Snowden revelations. And in the Supreme Court, the government attorneys got up and said, one, the idea that the government was spying us was, in their words, speculation. And secondly, they actually went on to say, and you know what? If they were being monitored, the government would tell them. Well, we now know from Snowden that it wasn't just us who were being spied on, but everyone, including everyone in this room. So the Second Circuit waited for that ruling. And they said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing, means a right to bring the case, in Hedges versus Obama, and they threw it out. And the Supreme Court refused to take it. We filed a petition to the Supreme Court, and they refused to take it. This is all under Obama. It's Obama who's used Wilson's Espionage Act 8 times to shut down whistleblowers. The Espionage Act is the equivalent of the British Foreign Secrets Act. It is an act that was meant to prosecute those who gave vital government information to those who were deemed to be a hostile or an enemy power. It was never designed to shut down whistleblowers who gave information to the press about the malfeasance of government. And Obama has used that act so aggressively. And because the NSA is able to carry out wholesale surveillance, and I speak as a former investigative reporter for the New York Times, there is no investigative reporting now of the centers of power. It's impossible. Because anyone who attempts to leak or speak to a reporter is instantly traceable, which is why Snowden had to flee the country.